Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and today we're going to do something a little bit different. Recently we spoke about whether or not it would be possible to see a future Total War Lord of the Rings game. The video was rather fun to produce and it seems that you, the community, were quite interested in the matter, so why not carry on with the speculation and now look towards possible faction focuses, where we could discuss the possible factions and what their armies would have in terms of units. So for this video, let's start with my personal favourite faction during the War of the Ring, the White Hand of Saruman, Isengard. The Fortress of Isengard is the main base of operations for Saruman the White. Originally a friend to man, dwarf and elf alike, over time Saruman's heart would fall to darkness. Saruman had cast aside his love of nature for that of industry, as he grew closer and closer to the darker powers of Middle-earth, entering an alliance of convenience with the Dark Lord Sauron. Although it is known that Saruman had only allied himself with Sauron in an effort for himself to secure the One Ring, and possibly even betray the Dark Lord in the future. Of course, the White Wizard alone, as powerful as he may be, could not topple kingdoms. For that he needed an army, and an army he did build. Skulking orcs, powerful, strong Urukai, and gunpowder-based weaponry which can shatter walls in an instant. For the purpose of this video, we'll divide each of the respective units into their own section, with each unit also including any possible subunits that may be attached to it too. First, we'll look towards the Orcs, the basic tier 1 and possibly tier 2 units that could be found in an Isengard roster. Orcs would be the most generic troop in an Isengard army. They would be expected in large numbers, a basic horde skirmishing unit. Generally low leadership with mid to low average stats all around. The Orcs themselves would be your basic troop that you can recruit from not only a capital city, but also a small building chain. The Orcs themselves would probably fill out the largest majority of the Isengard roster, seeing as they are extremely numerous and have been known to use a large variety of different weapons. The lowest tier, which most people refer to as tier 0, would probably be as follows. 3 different units: Orcs with hand weapons, normally represented with swords, Orcs with spears, and finally Orcs with additional hand weapons, possibly represented by wielding 2 axes. These would be your possible basic choices which fill out the basic battlefield role, with the additional hand weapons unit being an anti-infantry warrior. From there we would move on to a more armoured type of Orc. This would be your basic tier 1, Orcs with hand weapons and shields, spears and shields, possibly also with great weapons, and finally Orcs with bows. This would fill out the rank roster quite nicely. Now obviously a bunch of units are already represented here and that might be enough to fill out a roster. It might seem like it is a bit much, but bear in mind that these Orcs should be considered basic units. They would be quite weak in terms of stat wise, and yeah, you would want to field them early on, especially since a large variety of weapons choices are covered here, but they wouldn't be spectacular, and of course they would not be able to match up to human units. Now, of course, these wouldn't be all the Orcs available to the Isengard forces, as the forces of Isengard do indeed have 1 unit of cavalry. These would be the Warg Riders, Orcs mounted upon feral dog-like beasts which are incredibly tough. Obviously, to be able to recruit these units, you'd need a completely separate building, as it doesn't make sense to include wargs with the basic Orcs. I'd imagine them being represented as a skirmishing based shock cavalry. 2 units in total, one with bows and hand weapons, and the other with spears and bows. They wouldn't be large in number, but they would be fast, durable, and quite powerful versus early infantry and cavalry. It could also be possible to allow the recruitment of feral wargs, wargs without riders, which you can use in a similar sense, just without having any extra firepower mounted on top of them. But now we'll move on to the tier 2 units, the lightly/medium armored Urukai, normally referred to as the Urakai Scout. Urakai Scouts would be lightly armored, less in number than the average orc unit, but far tougher, and it is likely that we'll see 3 different variations, that of Uruks with hand weapons, another with hand weapons and shields, and finally one with bows. The bows themselves would be considered short bows, but they would be extremely hard hitting due to the strength behind the Uruk. These would be your entry-level Urukai, and yes, right now, the roster itself doesn't look too impressive, but you've got to bear in mind that this would fit in thematically. Very early on, Saruman himself tried to keep as unknown as possible. He would send out scouting parties and so on, but he did not want to draw too much attention until he was ready. Saruman, of course, was obviously no fool, but it shouldn't take long to move on to your third tier of units, that of the heavily armored Urukai. These are the ones more commonly known in media, where they would be heavily armored, much more regimental, and have 3 different variants: sword and shield, the long pike, and finally the crossbow, for an armor-piercing ranged unit with a decent amount of actual range. These are your heavy and elite troops, the last tier that you could get in terms of anything infantry-based, though it is important to note that Isengard itself is a primarily infantry-based army. And now finally we have the more unique form of units, that of the Urekai Berserkers, unarmored, near-naked warriors which themselves would wield great weapons. These are your infantry destroyers. Tough and resilient to pain, they'll charge into the battlefield, not caring about their own lives. It's more than likely that this unit itself would either be a single entity or a small group of units. I'd prefer the latter in all honesty, as single entities should probably be left for, well, heroes, lords, legendary characters and the like, and big monsters of course. After that we'd have the sapper units, only pretty much useful in sieges of course, due to the fact that they're there to destroy walls, so it's more than likely that rather than a normal unit to recruit, these would act as siege equipment. Instead of having access to siege towers, I'd imagine that the Urukai would have access to battering rams, ladders, and sappers. The sappers of course supplementing siege towers. What is the true need of taking over a wall when you can simply just blow it up? And finally the ballista, more often referred to in games and the cinematic franchise. There is a need for a siege weapon, especially if the Isengard forces will not have access to siege towers. Something like this could knock out enemy towers and possibly do some decent damage to any enemies attacking you with arrows, as obviously crossbows aren't really the type to use to do an arc of fire. But essentially that would be the basic unit roster for Isengard. It is indeed small, but it has everything that's actually needed. You don't need a massive roster to consider a full faction. Now you're probably thinking, where are the Dunlendings? And yes, in truth, there would probably be 1 or 2 units of Dunlendings available for Isengard. But in all honesty, I see Dunland as being made into a possible DLC race should Total War The Lord of the Rings ever become a real thing. So maybe a Dunlending unit or 2, possibly with hand weapons and additional hand weapons, but that would pretty much be it. Not too many Dunlendings would find themselves in this roster to allow the Dunlending roster itself to be its own thing. But now let's move on to Lords and Heroes choices. First we'll look towards the heroes, where I believe we'll get 2 different hero types per race, 2 for the Orcs and 2 for the Urukai. One of which would have the same battlefield role for both, the Banner Bearer. Yes, I believe that the Banner Bearer itself should be its own hero, a character which will be fielded across armies that acts as a morale booster, maybe having its own different banners which would allow it to provide different bonuses to the army. It would just be nice to see banners in the Lord of the Rings series should this ever get produced, and let's be honest, it doesn't make sense for every single unit, so why not have it as a hero? And lastly, we can look at both the Urukai and Orc Captains. Both of them would work as agents but could also be fielded in armies. These would be your basic support characters, which could probably even have an option to switch out their weaponry and even possibly armor. Say in respect of the Urakai Captain, you could have him with light armor with a sword and shield and a bow, or you could have him with heavy armor with a crossbow and sword and shield. Whereas the Orc Captain would be a bit more basic in terms of gear, possibly sword and shield and maybe even a bow, nothing too drastic. However, the benefit of the character itself would possibly be the option of mounting a warg. And yes, I am leaning towards a possible full warg army if you have the income for it. And as you can imagine, what I'd say here, Orc Lord and Uruk Lord for Lord choices, so we're not going to dwell into that too much, as they would act in a very similar way as the hero choices, but instead, being able to lead armies. In terms of legendary characters to use as a legendary Lord choice, well, there's two obvious choices here, aren't there? First would be Uglug, one of Saruman's Orc Captains, who led the charge against the Fellowship at the Battle of Amon Hen. Yes, this is the character that actually did it. LUSC is a film-made character, he was not in the novels. Uglug himself would be the Urukai character that people would want to start with. Given the fact that he also led scouting forces, it's very likely that he would start far away from Isengard. Maybe this could be a character which would have the choice of multiple start positions, given the element of choice, but acting in a way that Saruman himself had sent him on a mission with his armies. Speaking of Saruman, of course, that would be the obvious choice for another legendary lord, as he is indeed the faction leader of the forces of the White Hand. He is the White Hand himself. Because of that, his obvious start position would be at the fortress of Isengard. Obviously, the issue here is that magic for the wizards themselves, including Saruman, was never too much explored into. So I see this character more as a buffing character more than anything else. Maybe with a special ability that once per battle he could permanently turn an enemy unit to join his faction. This would represent the booming voice that Saruman has, and his influence over the mortal races. I'd imagine using Saruman as your chosen lord would also get you access to Grimmer Wormtongue. I'd see Grimmer implemented as a legendary hero of sorts. You wouldn't be able to use him on the battlefield, but mostly as an agent. Maybe with a special mechanic which could only be used once every 15 turns or so, where you could use Grimmer to go to an enemy's faction settlement and maybe force the faction into peace, or just start a rebellion there. This would represent Saruman working through Grimmer, so this makes sense to me at least. Obviously some people will probably disagree. But this is how I myself envision a Forces of Isengard faction for a possible Total War Lord of the Rings game. I know it feels kinda small, especially in the scale for a Total War game, but then again you have to realize that the forces in Middle-earth had their own specific armies. They didn't really have that many different types of troops, which made it far more interesting because rather than seeing 19 different types of Urukai, we saw a few different types of Urukai, some Denlendings, some Orcs and so on, for a varied mix. Obviously when you look towards other factions like for example Gondor, then you've got more choices with the Rangers, the standard Gondorians, the Knights of Dol Amroth and so on. Obviously this is all speculation based, as we don't know if Creative Assembly would be willing to do a Lord of the Rings, or if they could get the licensing for the Lord of the Rings as a possible future fantasy based game after they're done after Total War Warhammer. But what do you guys think about that army list and the heroes? Is there anything else you would add? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and let's start a bit of a discussion, shall we? But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince and Okro for subscribing to us at our Fane level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our King level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.